Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream. We have not one, but two special guests for you later on. I will introduce those in just a minute. A bit of news first, as we usually start with. Last night, what a night it was last night. It was great. We went to the protest against the sex survey in schools, organised by Glasgow cabbie Steph Shaw in Glasgow, obviously. How many people were there? I would say at least 150 would be my guess. But it was quite a crowd. So I gave a little speech. That's on YouTube. And a couple of other people gave speeches as well. But it's interesting. The sex survey really seems to have woken a lot of people up. And what we're trying to do as a family party is say the sex survey is the tip of the iceberg. The really concerning bit is the sex education. And so it's opening doors to us to communicate about that. But at this protest, we gave out a box full of our "What are they teaching our children" leaflets. And you can see people open them up and just staring at it in disbelief. So we're really trying to make the most of these of the opportunities that are presented. So Steph, if you're watching, thanks for inviting us. We'll maybe work again on something in the future. So that was really good last night. Thanks to the family party people who were there as well, helped giving leaflets out. That was really good. Now, we've actually got a meeting in Glasgow scheduled for tomorrow night. That was going to have been a members-only meeting. It was a strategy and planning meeting. But since we've been in contact with quite a lot of people in Glasgow the last couple of days, we're actually going to open that up and make that an open invitation meeting. Now, I haven't got the details to hand. I'll put them on social media tomorrow. So if you're in Glasgow or near Glasgow, if you want to come and meet us, then it's 7 or 7:30. I think it's a 7:30 start to the actual proceedings. It's in a hotel in central Glasgow. See our social media for details. It'd be great to see you, particularly if you're new. We've got a meeting in Kirkcaldy on Monday night as well. Again, we'll put the details of these on social media. That's open to all as well. Now, I had an email from the National newspaper today. Now, the National, you'll realise, we're neutral on Scottish independence, but the National is sort of completely on the other side of the spectrum on every other issue to us. So my video, Nicola Sturgeon is a sexist. I've spent a bit of money promoting that on YouTube, just £10 a day or something, just so a few more people see it. And I have some very good response to that. Anyway, so they sent an email saying, "Is this your video?" So it's like, did you plant the bomb? Yes, so I claimed responsibility for the video and sent them some of our policies and some other videos as well. So hopefully we'll have a hit piece in the National about that. I mean, there is zero probability, absolutely zero, that there will be any sort of fair discussion or presentation of the points I made in that video or in the email. It will just be a total hit piece that they'll do. But that's fine. That's fine, because some people will read the National and they will see through it and they'll think, well, maybe it's someone saying something a bit different but original and someone worth listening to, and they'll look us up and that will be good. So if you read the National, keep an eye open for that. I've also been in touch with another journalist from another newspaper, which I won't name at the moment, who is saying that he's looking into doing something about sex education in Scotland. I've sent him all of our extensive resources. He's pinpointed one area in particular he thinks is particularly controversial. So hopefully we're going to have that breaking through into the mainstream media as well. Okay, we've been plugging away at it for, literally a couple of years now. So that's promising. So watch this space. Let's see if we get into the media with that. What else? The protest in Glasgow last night was brilliant. We're looking at doing something similar in Edinburgh within the next few weeks. We're not sure, maybe outside Bute House, Nicola Sturgeon's house. We'll see. But we're going to do something in Edinburgh before too long. Right, council elections are coming up. We're working hard behind the scenes. We've got a sizable team of candidates. We've actually got, last I heard, 39 pretty well definites signed up to be candidates and a lot more maybes as well. So if you've got any interest in being a council candidate, do email chairman@scottishfamily.org and you could join in our online training. We've just got an informal chat on Friday night. The week after, we've got some online training and you can join in that. To be a candidate, there's a whole spectrum. It could be that you're a candidate who will produce a leaflet for you. You'll try and knock on thousands of doors, get people helping you, really be very, very active. At the other end, it might be that you fill the forms in, get your name on there, and just rely on our national campaign. So you don't even need to put your personal contact details on your leaflet. You can just put Central Family Party details. So wherever you would be on that spectrum, we value anyone who will be willing to be a candidate. So say chairman@scottishfamily.org if you are interested. Something to mention very quickly. I mean, this is a big story in the news ongoing. We've got a very definite policy on it. We don't mention it particularly often. Just say our policy, though, is basically to remove all coronavirus restrictions and just be back to normal. Back to normal. So masks in schools, go. Any idea of vaccine mandates, the remaining mask rules in Scotland. I mean, we definitely feel, as we felt at some other points as well, that it's time just to be back to normal. Back to normal. Stop obsessing over this. Just goes into the background with all the other health challenges that there are out there. It's time to get back to normal. Another issue to mention briefly, the Scottish Family Party has been ahead of the game very definitely on the issue of demographics. We've been talking about the danger of population decline for quite some time, but have you noticed it's suddenly everywhere? I mean, it seems like, BBC website, newspapers, there's person after person writing about the dangers of population decline. So we're definitely ahead of the curve, and we've got the ideas to do something about it as well, which I think the other parties haven't really. I put a thing on social media this week, it was interesting, and it showed that in Romania, there are twice as many 54-year-olds as there are 55-year-olds. Twice as many 54-year-olds as 55-year-olds. And the reason is that that's the point where they banned abortion. So in the next year, there are twice as many babies born. Now, the story in Romania is quite complex, and there are some ups and downs with it, but it just shows the difference it can make. Now, this event in Glasgow, we were invited to, this protest. That was great to have that opportunity. A couple of Sundays ago, I was in Glasgow, spoke to in a church, chock-a-block. Lots of people came to listen. Great. So these sort of opportunities for us as the family party, we grasp with both hands, because as a political party, you don't exactly get to be invited to take part in much. So if you're thinking, maybe the Scottish Family Party could come along to such and such events, maybe they could speak to such and such a group, then do get in touch. We'd be more than happy for myself or another one of our representatives to come along and talk to groups. Right, during tonight, don't forget, make comments. We'll try and pick up on a few comments there, coming up on the right-hand side of my screen. Next week on the live stream, we have Katie Faust. Now, Katie came on the live stream, it's quite a while, well over a year ago, maybe even 2 years ago. Now, she's in America, and she's a children's rights campaigner. Now, you may be thinking, children's rights campaigner, oh no, that's the last thing we need. But no, it's not someone I'm coming to debate about children's rights. Her idea of children's rights is that children have got a right to be brought up by their natural parents wherever that's possible. So it's a very different take on it. So we will talk about some issues there. So Katie is an excellent speaker, so don't miss that next week. Now, we'd hope to have someone on in the next few weeks whose story was recovery from drug addiction and involvement in drug services, now drug support services. So I was fascinated to talk to this person. That would have been really good, wouldn't it? But unfortunately, they work for a charity, and the bane of my life in the Scottish Family Party is people saying, oh, we're a charity, so I can't come and talk to you on the live stream. It's very frustrating. Surely if your mission as a charity is to promote a certain viewpoint or to share your experiences or to let people know about the issues, surely if you're given an opportunity to come and talk about them, so probably about 1,000 people in total will watch this between the different platforms. But it seems like, I don't know, it's very difficult to get people to come on where charities are involved. But on to tonight's special guests. Now let's bring them on one at a time. First of all, our very own Bruce Scott, who needs little introduction.
Hello,
welcome, Bruce.
Good evening.
Now, Bruce is not in his usual lair in Jedburgh. Where are you tonight, Bruce?
I'm in a consulting room in Edinburgh tonight. I've just finished work. I've had a very long day, but glad to come be here tonight and join the conversation.
Yeah, Bruce is always an interesting fellow to hear from. Very interesting, bringing his professional expertise. And then from over the Atlantic, we have Barry Perlman joining us. Now, Barry is a retired psychiatrist who's, we're going to be talking about the area of mental health, because the Scottish Family Party, we talk about mental health in some ways. Some of the ways where we think it seems to be getting out of hand, extending and extending. But Barry's coming from a pretty mainstream perspective. I don't think he agrees with us on some of our other policies. But Barry certainly got professional expertise, and he's going to talk through some of those issues with us. So welcome, Barry. Barry's in Manhattan.
It is very nice to be with you.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I still can't quite get used to the fact that we just talk to people all over the world.
Amazing.
It is.
And I want to just echo what you said, Richard. Our perspectives aren't identical, as you said. And I really want to say how much I respect you and the colleagues I emailed with over the last week or two, that you're willing to go forward with a conversation with someone who's not perfectly aligned with your views. I wish that could happen more in my country.
Yeah. I mean, our attitude is that basically we're all flawed human beings. So some people don't agree with the family party on everything. But even so, he's still very welcome. Yeah, so we're looking forward to hearing from you. So we're going to talk about mental health, psychiatry, etc., developments through your career. So some of your perspectives. And then towards the end, we're going to have a look at the Scottish schools. It's known as the sex survey. We're not going to look at the sex survey bits. We're going to have a look at some of the sort of mental health questions and see what we think of them. So Barry, take us away. Tell us about developments through your career.
My pleasure. First, I'm going to start by saying that the reason I am on this show is through a unexpected set of links, which brought me to another gentleman, Ramsey Fraser in Edinburgh. And that was because I wrote a memoir, which I hope people will consider taking a look at, purchasing, probably on Amazon, called Rear View. The reason I wrote a memoir, and You're the Family Party, and the book was written for my family. At the end of my career, I thought it would be nice for my children to have some idea of what their workaholic father was doing all those years. And then my grandson was born. It'll be a while before he can read a book, but I thought it would be great for him to have, again, something from his grandfather that explained how I had spent much of my working life. So I wrote the book. Part of the reason, and I think this may be important for listeners to understand, I went into psychiatry in part because my grandmother suffered from intractable depression when I was a child, which took my mother away from the family a good deal of time to try to find ways to assist her mother, who was in and out of hospital. Those were the days before the advent of modern psychopharmacologic treatment. My grandmother had electroconvulsive therapy. Now, if you were raised in a family like mine, the goal was always that the son should be a doctor. So I went to medical school. I was very pleased with that. And when I graduated from Yale Medical School, I had to decide what to do next and what specialty. And I think it's kind of interesting how people choose their specialties. And Bruce, I'm sure, went into psychology for intellectual reasons, but probably also for some personal reasons. At my medical school, we had an interesting assortment of characters. We had a neurologist with a foot drop, so he had a neurologic problem. We had a hematologist whose blood wouldn't clot. He had a clotting defect. We had an orthopedist who had a leg amputated, and we had an ENT doctor, ear, nose, and throat, who was missing an ear. So obviously there's very something personal, and I won't explain what it is, what attracts us to psychiatry. I'll leave that to humor and to people's own jokes. But I'm sure in large part my choice was because of the impact of my grandmother's psychiatric illness on our family as I was growing up. And then my mother, in the days when women did a lot of volunteer work, she became a pioneer in working with an organization here in New York called The Bridge, which worked with people after they left psychiatric hospitals to help them readjust to the community, because hospital stays in those days were quite long and people had big reentry issues. So you put all that together, and I end up going into psychiatry. And interestingly for me, the people who inspired me most were not particularly therapists, but were people who were interested. This is the late 1960s, early 70s, who were doing interesting and pioneering work in biological psychiatry, as it's called. And there was an enormous amount of progress early in my career in terms of psychoactive meds, antipsychotics, that permitted people to live in the community rather than spend their lives in what we in the United States would call state mental health hospitals, state hospitals. Rather, they might have occasional need for hospitalization, but not prolonged. And the antidepressants came along. One of the great revolutions, starting in 1948, was the discovery of lithium and subsequently other treatments for bipolar illness. So there was a revolution going on in trying to understand the brain underpinnings of mental illness in the from the 50s into the 60s and 70s. Unfortunately, the progress in those domains has not continued apace. It's leveled off. Those drugs are still useful. There are other treatments coming online, but the revolution hasn't quite continued. I'm sure Bruce would probably attest to that. And so what we now have is a system, especially for people with severe mental illness, combining a whole series of modalities, perhaps medication, physiological treatments, therapies, as well as other programs which help to provide support and boundaries for people to help them to realize their human potential. And I think
could you ask about the physiological treatments?
Electroconvulsive therapy.
Okay.
Today there are magnetic therapies, transcranial magnetic therapies, and so on. And so today there are a whole series of modalities which can be mixed and matched and hopefully help people to realize their human potential. In some way, in mental health, as in physical illness, the goal, I think, of medicine and people in psychology and allied fields is to help human beings reach their potential. Probably decades ago, someone who was in a wheelchair couldn't get to the office and so was stuck at home and couldn't participate fully in the life of their society. Now in the United States, we have programs which assist them with ambulettes and so on. They can get to the office and go as far as they can go. And I think that really is what most people really aim for, is to help other people realize their human potential to the extent that they are able.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting you're saying that they're leveling off of progress in terms of pharmacology. Would you say that leveling off is more general as well, or is it just in that aspect?
Well, no, I think what happens is neuroscience is incredibly complex. Immunology is incredibly complex. I'm sure you in Scotland read about the microbiome as we do in the United States. You get bursts in most fields. And so in cancer, the treatment has just excelled in recent years because of immune therapies that didn't exist 15 years ago when we just had chemotherapy. Today we have immunotherapy, which is saving people and extending life remarkably, people with lymphomas, blood cancers, that kind of thing. So I think in each field there's a period of rapid development, and then it takes a long time for the translational science to take the basic sciences and plug them into clinical to help with the next hopeful leap forward.
Mm-hmm. What's your take on that, Bruce? I mean, you obviously don't deal in sort of pharmaceuticals, I assume. You wouldn't prescribe drugs or anything like that.
No. I mean, originally my PhD, I researched the cognitive model of depression. The cognitive therapy. Aaron Beck, who was the kind of founder of CBT. I was researching that, looking at unconscious information processing and compared to like conscious self-report measures, and also looked at people who were on one of the at the time the newer antidepressants called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and so I was interested in the mechanism, the cognitive mechanisms of what was because in my field, this was like 20 odd when I was doing my PhD over 20 years ago now, but of course psychologists are always biased towards their own domain, and they were always trying to big up CBT and say that CBT was more efficacious and it helped to stop relapse, and antidepressants were worse at stopping relapse, etc. But after that I trained as a psychoanalyst at the Philadelphia Association, and it's interesting because the person who set up the Philadelphia Association was R.D. Laing, and he was a psychiatrist, but he's situated with the term anti-psychiatry. He actually hated that term, but he's associated with that movement. But and he was kind of critical of some of the practices in what was going on in psychiatry in the UK, of confinement in mental hospitals and things like that. And so he set up therapeutic communities in London, and so I trained there, and I did research on the communities and interviewed people who lived there with him and other people. This is the book here, they were interesting places because people came to them for a different experience other than the psychiatric hospital. And there is a whole, this is why I wrote the book about it, because there's a whole romantic idea that it was everyone just going crazy, not taking the medication or stopping medication, and completely anti-psychiatry. I mean, there was periods in different houses and communities where it was kind of like that, but the misconception about it was that people weren't allowed to see a psychiatrist, or people weren't allowed to take medication. That's not true. R.D. Laing said himself that someone wanted to see a psychiatrist and someone wanted to take a tranquilizer of some kind, fair enough. Because some people need that, and you can get very anti-psychiatry or romantic and just not take anything at all. But of course, that's very idealistic, and we live in a world where we have the technology to people suffer, and if people can't handle the suffering, if they need like an antidepressant, are you going to judge them for that and say, well, you're maybe the ideal is to not need medication where there's some risk of side effects, but anyways, my training was involved psychoanalytic ideas, and I suppose my training was quite eclectic in the sense it was very existential and influenced with continental philosophy. So now I practice that. So that's
Bruce. Out of curiosity, at a very practical level,
mm-hmm.
I know that certainly there were people more expert, for example, when I was practicing in family therapy, psychologists, some social workers. I would enter into collaborative situations, although for the most part I tried to do therapy with the patients, prescribe if they needed it, and do both. I would assume that you also, at a practical level, the message I would like people to take away is that really in any individual's plan of treatment, we try to integrate the best aspects which will be helpful based on an assessment of that particular patient. So you, I assume, I would guess would have collaborative relations with some psychiatrists in your area if some of your patients you think need medications.
Well, in my private work, it very rarely arises. But I mean, when I worked in institutions and hospitals, of course, that was very, the NHS is kind of set up in a kind of a multifaceted way, and there's different disciplines: occupational therapists, nurse practitioners, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. But an interesting example. I'm very friendly with a psychiatrist in Lithuania, Vilnius, a Dr. Alexander Alexichek, and he trained as a psychiatrist under Soviet totalitarian communism, and he was also interested in psychotherapy and set up his own kind of school of existential psychotherapy during the USSR. And I've been to the hospital a few times in Vilnius, and because he's the head of the department there of a specialist clinic department there, and yes, it's very much it is extremely holistic. It's very psychotherapeutically orientated, group therapy, individual therapy. But there's there's psychiatrists there, and and doctors, and they're tending to all the kind of facets of a person's well-being. And so there is a lot of collaboration, and it's extremely therapeutic. All the doctors, nurses, therapists together, they all are involved in therapy in the department.
I think that's, I would say that at our hospital, that was very much the approach. We had both inpatient units for people when they were acutely ill. We had day programs. We had community support programs to help people live independently, as well as therapy programs for outpatients. And again, I think it depends on the diagnosis, the level of disability, and so on. So one of the important changes that I think many of us saw later on, although I said much of the revolution stopped, for people suffering with schizophrenia, one of the big changes that I saw later in my career was the advent of clozapine, which was a new novel antipsychotic. And suddenly some of our patients in our clinics who were hospitalized 3 and 4 times a year might only need hospitalization every year or two. So in that case, the medication helping to control the psychotic aspects made them much more amenable to community reintegration, towards being supported so that they might begin to participate in work programs. And as I said earlier, in terms of the disabilities they had, begin to fulfill their goals and their abilities. And I think that's what the underpinning often of medications has been, be it lithium for people with bipolar illness, antidepressants, antipsychotics, is if we can control the most severe symptoms, then psychotherapists like yourself and other approaches can be very, very helpful in helping people to reconstruct lives. I would just also mention, you mentioned the person you trained with, Aaron Beck, his work. Aaron Beck just died about a week or two ago, and it was a great loss to the psychiatric world because he was such a tremendous pioneer in the field of cognitive behavioral therapy. So his loss was very much felt across the American psychiatric world, I think, when he passed recently.
Yeah, can I just chip in? I think I'm doing quite well here as the amateur. I'm learning well, I think. My next question is, I've got a bit of a picture then of that development over time, and the sort of, maybe multidisciplinary is not the right, but the range of therapies and supports that could be in place. I suppose the question I've got is, what's the overall pattern in terms of the incidence of mental health problems? Because the impression I get is that the incidence is skyrocketing. Is that particularly with women?
Right? I don't think the incidence is skyrocketing. I think what we find is that many of the illnesses, the serious illnesses, have had very constant prevalences in the world for decades. Schizophrenia, perhaps 1% or a little less, major depressive disorders in the 5% range. So many of the big disorders have stayed very, very constant. Perhaps what you're thinking of, Richard, is that more people, as the stigmatization of mental illness has diminished, as a result of the work of professional organizations and others for decades now, as that stigmatization has diminished, more people have been willing to avail themselves of the kinds of therapy Bruce does in his office, others do in clinics, in order to help them deal with conflicts in their lives, unhappiness in their lives. But I think that perhaps we should separate out the issue of skyrocketing incidence and prevalence and talk about the fact that people are more willing to avail themselves of services because it's viewed less askance than it used to be.
Uh-huh. Do you? What's your take on that, Bruce?
Well, I have a kind of more, I suppose, I come at it from a more philosophical, cultural. I mean, I'm not up to date on this the exact statistics of things, but of course, if stigmatization of mental distress is people are more able to speak about it without feeling shame or embarrassment. Although there will be people seeking out services, I think, but I think the kind of cultural zeitgeist of the kind of in the news, mental health crisis, it almost becomes like a kind of fashionable thing. I mean, I'm not trying to diminish anyone's suffering, but people like Frank Furedi has talked about this, the therapeutic culture. This kind of, I think, as James Hillman talks about this, we've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse, kind of idea. There is a notion of if one is directing oneself philosophically, one's outlook to the world, kind of becoming, as Foucault might say, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, who talked a lot about mental health. When you start problematizing the mind, or problematizing it in society, and of course, the socio-political aspects of society. We live in a very kind of capitalist society where and religion is fading to the background, and so what do you have? You have people with a lot of desires and needs and aspirations that can't for contentment, and therefore I suppose you could say from a kind of anti-capitalist standpoint, for example, you could say it from a communist standpoint too, but they come to the same conclusion, I think. But we create kind of discontent through the socio-economic political climate. Jacques Lacan, French psychoanalyst, I've got a little quote here. He says, "The aspiration of happiness will always imply a place where miracles happen, a promise, a mirage of original genius, or an opening up of freedom, or if we caricature it, the possession of all women for a man, or an ideal man for a woman. To make oneself the guarantor of the possibility that a subject will in some way be able to find happiness, even in psychoanalysis, as a form of fraud." So he's like criticizing this kind of the psychotherapeutic industry where guaranteeing happiness, and he said this to the sort of communist revolutionaries and the students in Paris. He says, "I'll tell you that the revolutionary aspiration has only a single outcome of ending up as the master's discourse. This is what experience has proved. What you aspire to as revolutionaries is a master, and you'll get one."
Bruce, let me ask you a question, if I may.
Yeah.
Because in my mind, there are two levels of dialogue going on. One is you are a psychologist in practice in an office, and if a person, an individual, is referred to you or comes to you, I would guess that the broader philosophic and political issues are left behind, and you try to address where that person's difficulties are. And as you said before, you're not minimizing anyone's suffering, you try to help them. So I would say, in the same way, I have political beliefs, I'm not neutral. And I know that psychiatry has been abused in the Soviet Union and in China, even in the United States. For example, with the hospitalization for years of Ezra Pound after the Second World War. But I think the philosophic and political aspect is quite different than when I meet somebody as a clinician. When someone comes into my consulting room or into my office and explains to me the problems they're having, then I have to consider, can I engage this person therapeutically, psychotherapeutically, and be of benefit? Should I prescribe medications? Should I enlist the services of a colleague because of the family issues? So I think we need to separate out. I think it's important for the audience, actually, to understand that when they come to any of us for care and help with their very, very difficult and challenging life situations, we're going to meet them where they are, not meet them ideologically. On the other hand, having beliefs, as we all do, we want to ensure that psychiatry and mental health is not abused by a society. And so what we're talking about are really two levels of discourse in making sure that there's a good balance that exists. And that perhaps even comes to the question of civil commitment in most countries, where we, in the United States, certainly in New York, have the ability, if someone comes to us who's a threat to others or high risk for suicide, the state says to us, you've got to protect that person or protect society by removing their civil liberties and hospitalizing them. On the other hand, we're going to give that person representation to challenge your decision in court. And so I think it's very, very important that we keep the clinical level separate from the political ideological level in order to reassure people who may want to come to me when I was in practice or come to you now at your consulting room in Edinburgh, that we're going to meet them where they are.
Well, I have problems with what he said there. I hope you don't misunderstand me and think that. When patients come to see me, I don't try to, or people like me, I don't think. I hope not, anyways.
You're likable.
They don't try to give them a political sermon, so to speak. Of course, you wouldn't want to get into that sort of thing. But regarding separating them, I think it's quite difficult to separate it when we're living in a culture. For example, in Scottish schools, essentially they're turning Scottish schools into a kind of mental health clinic. As Foucault puts it, they're problematizing the mind as an objective entity that needs to be dealt with. And the methods they use in Scotland is a kind of, I would say, based on the cognitive behavioural ideas and kind of what's it called, sensitivity groups. Of like group therapy, not like group, like almost like group therapy, but they're being kind of, and also and to a certain extent, the university with the kind of proliferation of the idea of mental health and mental healthism. So they're giving language. You know, I mean, I work with words. You know, and the words have a huge importance. You know, so when you think about these children growing up in schools, being told that, you know, when they feel sad, it's almost like a problem and an illness. I think the use of words can create a problem, and of course the school system is based on a political and socio-political policy, you know. So I think it's difficult to see where, you know, what comes first, you know, and what's separate, you know.
Well, you know, I guess I would say, assuming you're correct about the society enforcing, when the person comes to us, we still have to address what they are identifying as their issues. Where I think there may be some common ground between us is, for example, when I was chair of what was called the New York State Mental Health Services Council. I was always worried because the system created a push and a pull. We wanted children, for example, on the autism spectrum to get services, or we wanted children with significant mental illness to get services. On the other hand, people who wanted to do good and had good intentions sometimes were willing to place diagnoses on children in order for them to get services. And I would often object to that and raise concerns, because once you have a diagnosis connected to your name in state files or in medical files, those kinds of things stay with you for a long time, if not for life. And so I think we have to be wary to make sure of how the state exercises its power and its interventions in people's lives. But I have to say, I disagree that it's hard when someone comes to the consulting room to separate the political and ideological from the treatment aspect, because then we have to address symptoms, identified problems, help that person. We're not addressing society at that moment. On the other hand, when you work with Richard through the Scottish Family Party, you're trying to influence and hopefully your perspective improve people's lives in Scotland. Others see how that improvement might take place in different ways, but that's a political and electoral fight. That's not a clinical fight.
Do you think there's a difference though between, as a psychiatrist, people come along with specific problems and you seek to treat them for those problems. With more broad counselling, then people are talking about, you know, not so much a specific problem. It can be more about their life goals, trying to make sense of their life, seeking meaning, etc. So is that the difference between your perspectives? That in Bruce's interaction with clients, it's not so much trying to deal with specific problems, to treat specific problems. It does involve a more philosophical side.
I think I would ask Bruce to answer that, because I think it's an important question that you've asked, Richard. And I think when Bruce comes in and meets a new patient and they've told him their set of problems, the reason they've chosen to sit opposite him and consult with him, he has to then decide how he wants to respond to their issues. I suspect he's a very empathic therapist and probably very little didactic at that point, more interactive. But Bruce, what do you do?
Yeah, well, no, I'm not didactic. Could you just remind me the question again, Richard?
Well, but basically, when someone comes in, explains about an issue, what's your initial response? What's your starting point, and where do you head off initially?
Well, every single person's different, you know, and of course, I see people from different countries, And you know, if I've seen someone from China, for example, or from Greece, for example, which is you know, a lot of people from Greece are strong Orthodox Christians, for example, or in China, they come from a very kind of different. I think it's they come from different perspectives. I mean, I don't go into critiques of their culture of what's wrong or right with Orthodox Christianity, or what's wrong or right with Chinese communism, for example. But yeah, they come with their own set of concerns. And it is a puzzle. It is a puzzle. You know, you work with the words, you work with, and of course, then there's language barriers as well. But yeah, one works with the words and the importance that people place in words. I would say I don't work from in the Aristotelian sense of a process, like a technological way of going from A to B. At point A, you get someone who's depressed, you introduce a treatment, and then you've got point B, a cure. I would say in the Aristotelian idea, it's idea of praxis, doing the activity for the sake of doing it. So someone comes, is witnessed, is heard, is able to articulate their words, perhaps for the first time. I let them lead me, you know, and I'll comment on them, and we'll get into a dialogue. It's very difficult to know where it goes, and it kind of flourishes. Hopefully, often it does flourish a conversation where the confusions of their own language that they've constructed over the years. Yeah, and you know, perhaps I never even touch into politics or where they've come from or whatever, but it's their own the words that they bring, the confusions is that with that, and so it's a very personal. It's an activity for the sake of doing it, and we live in a very technological society where we're always feeling we have to do something. You know, sometimes in therapy, somebody will sit in silence, and that I'll finish. And for that for sometimes is very helpful, because they're always been on in a society where there's a high emphasis on achievement, on doing things, of going to college, of going to university, of getting a job and doing that. To take the breath, to be in silence, you know. So it's very different. And
Bruce, how do you consider when someone comes to you their explicit stated problem? I feel depressed. I'm terribly anxious lately. I'm obsessed with certain thoughts. I'm engaged in severe marital conflict. I would love for my marriage to sustain itself, but I'm afraid that it's flying apart. How do you integrate the actual problem, which the person explicitly states, into your thinking about the steps that you're going to take next in your interaction with them?
I mean, what do you mean by that? What do you mean specific? How do I integrate it into the step?
Yeah, no, I'm interested to know, because I've been listening, that things flow and you have a conversation, but I'm wondering about the consideration. Do you approach someone differently, and do you use different strategies or tactics in talking to someone with marital discord as opposed to someone with stated depression or inability to function at work or whatever they bring to you? How do you use their stated problem?
Well, it's like, well, how long's a piece of string? I mean, if someone's depressed, you know, I mean, of course I'll get them to elaborate on why they feel depressed in their life. There could be a multitude of different reasons. They could be depressed because their marriage is going bad, or their marriage is going bad because they're depressed. I mean, there's an infinite amount of kind of permutations we could go into, but I mean, someone may be depressed for a very good reason, of course, as well. I mean, people get depressed because they're in a terrible job. If someone's extremely anxious, it may not be apparent to them why they're anxious. They might be anxious for a very good reason. So it's not essentially pathological what they're suffering from. But it may be debilitating, no doubt. But it takes time, I think. Sometimes these problems are clearer than others, I think. But also, this is another consideration. I mean, consider this: someone is extremely depressed, and they're in therapy for quite a long time. They've tried CBT, they've tried antidepressants, they've tried Reiki, they've tried, meditation, and then they go to a psychoanalyst, for example. This is the last thought. This is it. I can't really do much. What am I going to do? And then they're in therapy for about a year or so, and they realise actually that there's no cure for them. But at that moment, they realise that there's no cure. It's like a paradox. Once they realise there's no cure, that in itself is a kind of cure. I think that's kind of an extraordinary philosophical point, kind of contra the technological idea of healing mental suffering. There's something quite mysterious about that. I mean, people like Wittgenstein.
I guess we have very different ways of thinking about this, you and I. And I think, or I would hope, that when people come to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, they don't have to wait years to find out there's no cure for a paradoxical epiphany. I think there are things that can be done and should be done, and the hope is that many of them can be restored to a more normal state of mood, and once they are, they're going to function better. And then there's the ability, again, as I said before, to use therapy to help them untangle difficult parts of their lives so that they feel more effective and feel more, to use a kind of overused word, actualized within their lives. I think that it's important for people when they seek services to feel like there's an ally who is collaborating with them towards their goals within a realistic framework. And certainly it doesn't always work. I agree with you, but I hope that we try to address these issues in a timely fashion.
So can I jump in with a question? Where time is marching on.
Yep.
This is my concern. I think the definition of mental health seems to be expanding and expanding, and more emotional states are being described in mental health language, and I think that's a concern, particularly in schools. And I think my concern with it is that if someone's feeling a bit worried or a bit low or whatever, then I think in normal life the person might think about what steps they can take in order to try and sort that out, cheer themselves up, get on with something, take the mind off it, or whatever. That sort of thinking. Whereas I feel when a mental health label is applied to it, that the tendency would be to shift the person's perspective to, right, someone needs to get me out of this. I need some sort of treatment. So it's sort of internally debilitating in the person's conscious life if you like.
You know, a
Do
very
you think
good,
that's fair, Brian?
I think a very good example of what you're saying, Richard, because I don't think most people who are professional in the field would disagree with you. They don't want to have every emotion be pathological and need care. And I think a very good analogy, and you might use it going forward, is someone who's lost a significant person in their lives. They're mourning. That is normal. We know that mourning after a significant loss is usual. Most people can handle it. They get through it. It's hard. We never forget people we love. But within 3 months, 6 months, people's quote unquote biological rhythms are returning to normal. Their appetite is coming back. They're sleeping well again. They're beginning to function at work well again. The mental health person, they might not consult Bruce or consult me until 6 months out if they haven't begun to move past that loss in any way. And then we might speak about pathological mourning and depression and the need for treatment. But most people with good support systems, strong family systems, friendship systems, they get through most life crises quite well on their own. We see that after natural disasters. And so I think that might be a good way for you to talk about it.
Do you think it's the case that if people do classify what are actually normal emotions, if they do classify them as mental health issues, do you think that can inhibit progress with that issue? It can make it longer lasting, it can make it more severe.
I think people, to quote Bruce, are all individual. For some people, perhaps talking to a therapist is helpful, and that's fine. For other people, most people, we get through it on our own with support and help from our families, from our friends, from our own strength and resilience. And we don't need for every little obstacle to resort to a professional intervention. So, what a good professional should help a person do, and I hope you'd agree, is sort that out. And they'll say to some people, someone might come to me after a loss, and I'd say, you seem to be doing okay. It's hard to lose someone you love. If nothing is better in 6 months, give me a call back again, but not right now. And other people are much more vulnerable. We're all individual again. Some people, the least breeze knocks them over, and other people can stand up in a hurricane force wind and be strong. And I think we need to think of people along that spectrum of susceptibility.
Mm-hmm. But what do you think, Bruce? Do you think that the sort of mental health mindset, if you like, can inhibit people's ability to cope with ordinary emotions?
Well, I think if it's too narrow, if it's like too technologically narrow or theoretically narrow, like in schools where it's based on a CBT idea of the mind, it kind of negates other ways of thinking about human problems. I mean, I'm quite even critical of psychotherapy, the psychotherapy world, psychoanalysis. There's a joke that goes around. Some colleagues is like, people suffer from psychoanalytic itis. This idea that they see that the prism of their existence through, psychoanalytic theory or cognitive behavioral theory. I was listening to a podcast this other day about anxiety. It was by some religious, a reverend in some church. I forgot his name. Talking about anxiety, and of course, from a spiritual Christian perspective, for example, they would have a different take on it. They would say, well, in the Bible it says, you shouldn't entertain anxiety. You should, pray, for example, and I'm not advocating that for anyone who's listening, but it shows. I mean, it's philosophical. The idea of the paradox, the paradox of a technological mindset, as I said before, that we get trapped in sort of these philosophical traps of problematizing human emotions in a certain way and thinking, well, I feel this, I'll have to get rid of it. And you see it in a linear process of, as I say, the Aristotelian sense of process going from A to B. But human existence, I think, philosophically, certainly some process-orientated treatments for certain things work very well. I'm not criticizing that. If someone can be on antidepressants for 6 months or a year and that gets them through it, fair enough. That's nothing wrong with that. You do get people who've done a lot of things, as I say, who've done different therapies, done different drugs. I've worked with people who've been on medication for a long time, and through the help of their doctor, advice, they've come off the medication completely, very slowly over a period of time. And I think therapy, because of sometimes it takes a long time, I think, and although there is a danger of a psychoanalytic-itis, of course, you don't want people to be hooked on therapy or for a long time. But sometimes people's lives have been so troubled, I think. Sometimes generally speaking, I would say between 1 and 2 years, once a week therapy, most people can get something out of it. That might sound a long time, but it's in the grand scheme of things, if they've had 20 years or 30 years of problems, it's not that much. But
there's another bit of common ground, I think, between Bruce and I, is that therapy for most people shouldn't be indefinite. They're not there to entertain the therapist and be an interesting case. Again, when goals are reached, when endpoints are reached, it should end. They can come back again with another situation. I had a wonderful teacher when I was a resident who said to us, at least in the beginning, have a job, because if you only have 2 or 3 patients, it's very hard to discharge one of those patients from treatment if that means you're losing half to a third of your income. Later on, when you have 100 patients or 50 patients, it's easier to be really free about that and say, I think you've realized the goals that you came to therapy for. We can stop now. If you have another crisis or a need, you have my phone number.
Yeah.
Just on the theme of stopping now, our hour has passed. So that was very, very interesting. I've been mainly listening.
Freudian of you, Richard.
Yeah. So Barry, do you want to mention your book, and then I've got some.
Right. Richard was kind enough to say I could plug my book. I think in the UK and Scotland you have Amazon, so please go to Amazon if you found what I said interesting. Type in Barry Perlman. The spelling of my last name is on the screen, and then the word rear view. My memoir will pop up. I hope you'll find it interesting and educational. Thanks very much for letting me participate in this great hour with Richard and Bruce. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Pleasure. Great to have you there. Thanks, Bruce, as well. I'm just going to respond to one comment. You stay on screen, but it's just so Ali, I started reading this. I thought it was a joke at first. Someone asking what we thought about the signing of a footballer. I was thinking, I thought it was just someone trying to be funny. Then I realized it was this footballer found guilty of rape in a civil case, but not in a criminal court. Now controversy. I just thought I'd respond to that because the family party has a very definite policy on this, and our policy is that you shouldn't be able to try a case in a civil court when you've been found innocent in a criminal court. So for a very serious crime like rape, if you are accused of that, it goes to the criminal court, and you're guilty or innocent there, or not proven or whatever, and that decision should be it. The accuser shouldn't have a second bite of the cherry, taking it to the civil court where the standard of evidence is much, much lower. So that situation wouldn't exist. With our policies implemented, he would have been found innocent, and that would be the end of it, which we think is much fairer. So, Ali, hope to see you on Monday evening in Kirkcaldy, but there's an answer to that question. So we've run over very slightly, but right, thanks for joining us or watching later, and see you next week.
Right.
Good night.
Bye.